This morning, on this Easter day, I'd like us to think about what is the most important question in history. And it's simply this: did Jesus or did Jesus not rise from the dead? Why is that the most important question? Well, throughout the rest of the New Testament, that was the difference between Jesus' disciples and those people in the synagogue down the road. For us today, it's the difference between the Christian believer and all those people who would argue that, well, one religion's just like any other, isn't it? And it's because that belief that Jesus rose from the dead is the thing that really changes lives. What we see in our passage this morning from Matthew chapter 28 is just a description of that first Easter morning. And I'd like us, though, this morning to focus on that and hopefully to pick up some of those details that otherwise we so easily miss. If we look at our passage, what we see is that it was early in the morning that two women went to the tomb. Why is that significant? Why is it important that it's named that it was women who went to the tomb? Was it just the case that the men couldn't be bothered to get up that morning? Almost certainly not. But what is significant about it being two women is that in those days, in a very primitive society, women were not considered to be credible witnesses. Women were not allowed to give evidence in court. Women in that early society were really considered as little more than property, and therefore their word could not be taken seriously. And yet the gospel presents women as being those who gave testimony to the resurrection. Had somebody been wanting to fabricate the story and do it convincingly, they would have chosen to have highly reputable men who were put forward as witnesses to the resurrection. But no, what we see in our passage is that the gospel accounts tell it as it was. The second thing we see in this account is that there were guards appointed to the tomb. Both the Roman authorities and the Jewish authorities were very happy to see Jesus dead and buried. They wanted to see the back of him. He was the one who was stirring up trouble, stirring up commotion. So they were quite happy that he was gone. Now, Jesus was well known to have said that he would rise again. And therefore they didn't want to risk any of that. So what we see in our passage is that they appointed guards or posted guards to the tomb. Now let's think about it. If you're posting guards to the tomb under those sort of circumstances, what sort of person do you post? Inevitably, it's going to be the hardest, the toughest. Those who've seen everything before, and those who can handle situations. They were the ones who were there at the resurrection. And what we're told is that there was an earthquake. The second earthquake in 3 days. At the first one, we're told, was at the death of Jesus. Rocks were split. The veil in the temple was torn in two. In some of the gospel accounts, we're given the reaction of the centurion at the execution, who said, "Surely this was the Son of God." Imagine what it would have been like to have been one of those hard, specially selected, tough guards on that first Easter resurrection morning. There they are in the early hours in a graveyard. The earth quakes And the next thing they see is an angel. An angel described whose appearance, his face shone like lightning and clothes were as white as snow. What our passage tells us is they became dead faint. They froze. They were petrified. They were full of fear. And what we see in this account is that the angel then spoke to the women. And the message of the angel was, as he spoke to them, he spoke words of comfort. He said, "Do not be afraid." They had nothing to fear. The guards, they were terrified, but the women had nothing to fear. Why did the women have nothing to fear? Well, what the angel then shows is that, he had knowledge of them. He said to them, "You are looking for Jesus." He knew why they were there. He knew that they were seeking Jesus. And so he had words of comfort. Don't be afraid, he's not here, he's risen. He presumably equally knew that whatever it was, and we don't know, we can only speculate, whatever it was that was going on in the minds of the guards. Maybe they were thinking, this is a good bit of overtime. Maybe they're thinking only a few hours to go and it's a shift. There's no indication. They weren't there seeking Jesus. No words of comfort to them. And it's to those who seek that it was revealed. He's risen. But what I'd like us to notice is there must have been, in the minds of these women, some element of doubt. Because the angel said, "Look, come and see. Come and see the place." He's offering evidence. Come and see the place where he was laid. And finally, what we notice is that the angel then gave these women, those who'd sought Jesus, those who, yes, maybe had their doubts, but those who had nothing to fear, he gave them a purpose. To go to the disciples and to tell them that he's risen. But more than that, if we look at the passage, they had a specific instruction to the other disciples, and that was to go and wait for him in Galilee. Well, actually, we know that Jesus, the risen Jesus, appeared to his disciples in Jerusalem. So why mention here, go to Galilee and wait for him? Well, it was in Galilee that Jesus gave all of his disciples the commission, the Great Commission, to go into all the world and to spread the news, that he's risen, to take the good news further. So what these women are told to do, ultimately all of his disciples are told to do. So in this resurrection morning, we see that those who are seeking him are comforted, they receive comfort. We see that actually a really important point. God knows all of us. He knows our thoughts. Where maybe we might have doubts, God will address that too. And for those who seek him, there's a purpose. The purpose to be involved in his great mission of making the good news of this resurrection known. But the question remains, is it true? Is it true? I know that people will say to me, but look, in the ancient world, there are lots of incredible stories, and sometimes they include people coming back from the dead. Yes, there are. But actually, those stories are very different to the gospel account of Jesus. Very different in the way in which they are told or written. They tend to be written in a very vague, a way that's not presented as meant to be believed. It's a bit like long, long ago in a galaxy far away. What did we get? Star Wars. It's a great story, it's great fun, but nobody's meant to believe it. It was just in the vague unknown. We're not going to give any details because it's just fiction. I remember when my children were growing up at one point, they used to like, long ago in a land of make-believe, there was Merlin. And it's great fun. But nobody believes that it was true because there's no detail. The gospel accounts are very different to that. The gospel account of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus are located in history. They're very specific in time, specific in location, specific in the people involved. Very different to many ancient stories. People will also say to me, yeah, but you can't believe it because we can explain why the story of the resurrection grew. One explanation is, well, the authorities stole the body and therefore there would be an empty tomb. But if the authorities, the Roman or the Jewish authorities, had taken the body, why would they do that? There's no motive for them to do so. They wanted him dead and buried. And why would they support the story that he'd written? Why would they take the body? And even if they had taken the body in safekeeping, there weren't squeamish times. If at some point news was circulating that Jesus had risen and they possessed the body, they'd have no qualms about producing it and saying, well, you say he's risen, we say he's not. Take a look at this. Some people suggest that, well, maybe the disciples stole the body to spread a story, that help them spread a story that he's risen. But actually, what we see of the disciples is at the arrest, they fled. Following the execution, they were hiding away. They would hardly be the people to take on a hand-selected guard to steal the body. They just didn't have it in them. And even if they had, many of these went on to suffer immense persecution. Some of them were even executed. Why would they do that for something that they knew to be false? If they fabricated it? No, they wouldn't do that. And the one I always find most amusing is some people try to argue, well, maybe the women went to the wrong tomb. Yeah, they got up on early in the morning and they took the wrong path and got a bit confused and, well, they got to an empty tomb. Well, had that happened, what would be the natural response? Imagine you were in their position. You've got there, it's early in the morning and the tomb's empty. Would you assume, wow, he must have come back to life? Or would you think, hang on a minute, maybe this isn't it, we must have taken the wrong path back there, let's try again and find it? Of course you would. Now, it's very clear that there was a problem for those who would argue that Jesus at the time had not come back to life, and that was the body had gone. Jesus had been raised back to life. What that leaves us confronted with this morning is really what this story is all about. We see in the resurrection the power of God. We see the power of God to save individuals. Christ, who had gone to the cross, had come back to life. And therefore, we can have that word of comfort that what he did is accepted. We have nothing to fear because Christ is raised from the dead. We can have that assurance that we've got nothing to fear in the full knowledge that actually God knows us. He knows our thoughts. He knows what we're like. In the full knowledge that maybe we have doubts, well, he'll help us with that. And actually, when we come to that point of being changed by the fact that Christ came back to life, God will give us a purpose in life which we can pursue with him in his great work. That is the power of the resurrection. And let's face it, if God can raise Christ from the dead, then what he can do in our lives is infinite. And let us as a church never settle for anything that tells us any less